remind everyone that we are being recorded today, and the recording is actual record of our meeting today, and it will serve as, we don't officially take meeting minutes, so the recording in and of itself is the purpose of the meeting, and it's taking care of any official minutes, and it will serve as the minutes as no minutes are produced. So this is the Tennessee Funding Committee on School System Leadership, meeting number 2. So Janice, thank you for doing that. Thank you for reminding us that. Senator Representatives, we thank you for joining us today. Last meeting that we were here, we had a group of school superintendents, and then Mr. Parker from Shelby County Schools, Memphis Shelby County. He is our finance expert. He's a finance director in Memphis and Shelby County. And so, Janice, I think you have several things that you need to at least review for us and share with us there, that just our reminders and our purposes.
Absolutely. And if you'll bear with me just a moment, I want to make sure I note that the Tennessee Department of Education is very excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss our state formula. So if you'll bear with me, I will read through this to help us kind of get rooted in our purpose and get started. So conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. Thank you for allowing me to read through that, but I do think that helps us move forward into thinking about a forward-facing public funding and the opportunities for our students for that future state of Tennessee. We have got the meeting together. I think the next item, Chairman, is to think about a vice chair.
We do, and I don't anticipate any time that I will not be able to chair our meetings, but we have been asked by the department to elect a vice chair. So at this time, I'd open the floor for nominations for a vice chair.
I would like to nominate Russell.
We have a nomination for Russell Dyer, the director of Cleveland City Schools. Any other nominations?
Move that nominations cease and Dr. Dyer be elected by acclamation.
Thank you. If you're in agreement with that, any other thoughts, comments, ideas? If you're in agreement that nominations cease and we elect Dr. Dyer by acclamation, if you would please say aye.
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 Okay, thank you, Russell, for being able to serve in that capacity. So, again, I don't anticipate being out, but Russell, I know, will do a great job taking over if we do need to move into that area. I'd like to just kind of open up discussion from last month, or I keep saying last meeting, just to remind ourselves of where we were. And again, Janice's statements to us that we're not trying to revise the BEP, but we are simply trying to come up with a new funding formula that is student-centered and has those student weights to that. I know we are one of several subcommittees that are working toward that end. And specifically, we're going to need to, or I would encourage us to look at that from the perspective of district leaders. As we think about the other pieces of that formula, certainly we're looking at classroom pieces and we're looking at all the supports that a student will need. And we'll be looking at those from the lens of those things that are essential to have, those things that would be nice to have, and those things that would extremely be nice to have or might be alongside. I think is the way that the slides reflect those as potentially could have. But looking at that through the lens of equity, looking at that through the lens of adequacy, And what are those things that we all need to know as district leaders that make sure they get included in those? And I say that because I think there are several other groups, as I mentioned, working on the topic, and they'll be very in tune to those are things that that need to go into that base formula. But let's make sure we use our district eyes to say, yes, I've heard a lot of talk about nurses, for example. So yes, if we agree that every student needs access to a school nurse, we as district leaders might proceed, depending upon the size of the school district, might say that, well, we might need a nursing supervisor to oversee those nurses, depending on the size of the school system. So as we look at this, let's not forget to use our lenses as district leaders to include some of those district supports and those district items that need to be included in there. And again, as the slides show there, we all have input, we all have expertise, and again, we want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And for those that are not particularly a part of this committee, they're welcome to contact any member of this committee at any time and share input or share ideas. And we as committee members will bring those ideas back together and reflect upon those and decide what we need to do with those. In terms of our goals in the next upcoming meetings, it is our responsibility for Ms. Janice will be collecting our thoughts and our ideas and our recommendations, and she will send those to us for review. So as we have recommendations of what that we need to include in those base formulas, and if you remember, there are those weights that go on top of there for each student. So as we look at that, any reflections from last meeting on things that have come to your attention, maybe more questions that we need additional information from the department or from other groups that are working, we would open the floor for that discussion at this time.
Dr. Weeks, would you like for me to pull up the subcommittee chair overview that has the visuals for the weighted categories, the triangle?
That'd be very nice. The triangle or the pyramid, yeah, we can look at that.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. I'll pull that over. It may help jog some memories or conversation there.
Yeah, that looks good. And again, so as we look at the pyramid, the base are those things that we would say would be essential for every student to have that access to. Mm-hmm. The weightings would be those multipliers that might be assigned to special groups of students or special categories of students, if you will. And then again, the direct funding, other supports in addition to what we might want to include. And then we talked about outcome-based, that if we had students who participated in XYZ activity, how a district would receive a reimbursement for participating in that particular program or activity. And again, I think the only caution there is that was not to be a tie to the accountability model, but more of a participatory, if a student participated in an ACT retake, if a student participated in a dual enrollment or an AP class, that if they were successful, they would get the benefit of an outcome base from that perspective. So looking at the base,
Danny?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Rob Britt. Hey, just wanted to see, could you clarify, maybe Janice, somebody clarify a little bit more about the direct funding piece of the pyramid? When it says dollar amount for special or different programming, what can you give me some examples of what that is?
Janice, you want to do that? I know there's the slide. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about direct things that are more directly funded that could be specific and they're that fixed cost tied to like support for ACT, ensuring the 4 credit courses for high school students. So ensuring those early post-secondary opportunities. So some fixed cost that would be very tight and specific toward something that you feel is really prioritized and moves toward that a big priority. So something you would want to really customize and be specific for a direct group.
Gotcha. So where does art, music, PE, some of those related or co-curricular activities or classes, where do those fit in? Are they at the base then, or where do they fit into the model?
Yeah, I think that's what's open for discussion. I think that's what really is for these groups, these committees, to help really think through what would be in that base, and then those weights, each of those 4 categories. But that base would be, what do we want all students in Tennessee to have access to? This is what it would take for all students to have high quality opportunity. So, I've heard several things, people thinking about what would you need baked into that base.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Janice, can you check our waiting room, please? We may have someone there.
Oh, I'll be happy to.
Danny, everybody, just a quick thought from John Barker here in Memphis, and a quick clarification. I'm Deputy Superintendent for Strategic Operations and Finance, so I'll allude to our Chief Financial Officer from time to time, but I appreciate that, though, Danny, the extra effort of kind of putting that finance around. Definitely have that responsibility over the folks who have a little bit more technical knowledge and day-to-day than I do. But we've had some great conversations, and I think that's absolutely what you guys are seeing, in your districts and across this whole effort too, because, I think that it's a conversation of really what should be in the base. So one of the things that we've been talking about over the course of last week, around the issue of equity, and I really, really appreciated that we talked about the conversation last week, or had it in the conversation last week, that equity is such a strong driver for us here because, we do have students across our district, and really the challenges and opportunities that really need a substantial amount more to bring them up. So, cases in point, students who are in abject poverty and who've had a number of learning challenges. Is that going to be base? Is that going to be weight? Is that going to be, so how are we kind of thinking about this, and at what level, what tier? To Janice's point just now about those direct funding opportunities, are those special kinds of things that would be, episodic? Would it be something that we would bake in to a particular kind of thinking? But just on the issue of RTI, I know that came up last week. Right now in our district of 116,000, including our charter schools and all the district-run schools as well. So 116,000 students, and we got 42 RTI positions. It's something that's considered at that base. But, are we thinking that there might be some cases in which there might be a base that's there, that everybody gets that, but then there's a weight even still on top of that for particular kinds of needs? I think it's a great conversation. I love, thinking that there's, kind of across the board, everybody gets, all students have, to Rob's point about access to art, literature, art, music, the school nurses. Right now the school nurse ratio, that 1 to 3,000, that just doesn't even seem to make sense, kind of thinking around, that great healthcare need, especially as we're seeing it now with a lot of our students, in the COVID days, that I think, having that thought and having the conversation around what that base is, but then are there some of those weights that particularly address some of those needs that might be alluded to in the base? Every student have access to a school nurse in whatever strategy and whatever kind of ratio, but that in high need areas, and maybe even to Janice's point about those direct times, do you scale up? Is there a flexibility in this model that scales up for particular kinds of initiatives?
Great thoughts. And John, I certainly don't have the answer to that, other than, my first initial reaction is that, again, as a nurse, I think that would be in the base salary. There's Steve. Thank you, Steve. Welcome, Steve.
Sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
We're glad you joined us. I think those base indicators are going to be those things that everyone needs, and then the weights, for instance, for someone who might have extreme health extremities that would need an additional individualized or personalized service for nursing or healthcare potentially would be something that we would weigh. Certainly the poverty discussions, I think, as my understanding would be those things that would be listed. And, I think all of those were some samples that we talked about last time that we met. Students with disabilities, ELL, whether rural or urban, or whether, larger or smaller size districts, would have those. So I think those would be some of the ways to consider in there.
And Dan, just one quick thought, because one of the things that came up for us over the course of last week in conversation is mobility. One of the challenges that we have, and the literature is pretty strong on this too, as students move around a district, and I'm sure, urban districts, see this maybe a little bit more pronounced than maybe some others, but if you have a student moving among schools, even within a rural district, suburban district, ex-urban district, that, that may be one of the kinds of things that we would think about for this weights area, that, when you see those kinds of things that show up in the literature as being really problematic challenges, if the funding formula can take into account those kinds of things, and again, mobility is just kind of an issue and an example for us here, but that would be definitely something that is of interest to us, because we have about 18% of our students who don't end up in the same school at the end of the year that they started it out with.
Wow.
Could I ask a question?
Please, sir.
Thank you. I apologize for missing the initial meeting, but I'm delighted to be with you in this one. I was here back in the day when we first established the BEP in the 1990s, when it was part of the rural small schools lawsuit, and the work at that time with Governor McWhorter and establishing and voting on the funding for the BEP, which wasn't easy at that time. That said, one of the things I'd like to ask you about where it might slot into your thinking, and at least get it out there, because my background, I'm a clinical psychologist and used to be the commissioner of our Department of Children's Services here, and then spent part of a career in Alabama doing all the social services. But the analytics, the metric that is most predictive of life outcomes for our young kids is ability to read at the third grade level when you're finishing the third grade. Now, that's easy to say. It's hard to do, but I think as a legislator, I'm going to be wanting to see what are we going to be doing if we consider alterations to the BEP on this particular metric, given it's the best to invest, whether we call it base, whether we call it weighted, to get our kids reading at third grade level by the time they complete the third grade, because those adverse childhood experiences are not going to be overcome without a lot of attention, be it school nurses, school counselors. But that said, if we can get kids reading at the third grade level, we can teach them to read, and they can read to learn going forward. Just wanted to put that on your plate to help me understand how we might address that as leaders, and you as leaders. I get the privilege of working with 9 superintendents of schools, or I guess directors of schools, we call them now, in my Senate district, and ask them this quite often. So help me with that as we move forward, if you would.
Thank you for reminding us of that. And yes, sir, that is, I think all of us as directors are very aware of that. And that is one of our goals, is to have those students reading. And we certainly understand the challenges that go along with those. So thank you for bringing that up toward the forefront. And I think maybe some of those challenges or some of those bases that are family driven or circumstance driven, those also might be, some of the weightings that we have also. Representative Reagan, I see your hand.
Yes, thank you. In relation to the senator's question here, forgive me, I spent the better part of 2 decades as a business consultant using statistics. And so my question, which I always brought to my clients when I was working with them, was how are we going to declare victory? When do we know we have achieved our goal? Which means that we must define our goal. And we must define it in such a way that we can measure it. The senator mentioned metrics, and he mentioned a great one, third grade reading level. There are several others like 8th grade reading level, and there are more that can go into that. But at the end of the day, are we going to say victory is a graduate who is a good student or was a good student and is now a productive contributing member to society. Exactly how are we going to declare victory? Because that's going to ripple back down to what you're talking about here. When you talk about base, I have a little bit of problem with the word equity because that implies outcomes as opposed to starting points or equality of opportunity. But nonetheless, all that aside, I still need to know how we're going to declare victory. When are we going to be able to say we have achieved the goal by defining exactly what the goal is?
Thank you for that. We will capture that, and I think one of our latter meetings specifically helps address some of those topics, where now we're simply looking at the inputs into the base and the entire triangle, if you wish. So,
well, my point though is the inputs. If you have a system there, you have inputs, a value-added transformation, and then outputs. And of course, inputs are important, but all inputs are not equally important. And the way you know which ones are important is by going to the output, that is how we're going to declare victory, what our final metric is, and tracing it back through our value-added transformation to see what inputs were critical. So talking about inputs right now, the major input we can identify is we have students, we have instructors and administrators, we have text and instructional materials, and beyond that, the inputs are not so obvious as to how they affect the output. So I'm really struggling here to see that we've got some way of tying all of this stuff to the end product. You were talking about school nurses and so forth, and I agree with you. We need better than 1 to 3,000. That's just intuitive. But if we had 1 to 500, how would it affect our goal output? That is to say, a good citizen graduate who's productively contributing to society. Do we have a metric that ties that to it? Because quite frankly, the senator and I are the ones who allocate the money, and we are hired to be watchdogs for our taxpayers to make sure they're getting value for their money. And that ties back to the final output. So if you can help me out with that, I'd appreciate it.
Dr. Barnett, did you have a comment or question following that?
I think he's still on mute.
Stay, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, Danny, I was pointing at somebody to our driver that is driving recklessly on I-40. So,
Thank you.
I think those are great comments, and definitely what we, through this process, what we want to cultivate and weigh in on. I've captured your notes, Representative Reagan, on thinking about those outcomes and outputs that are a part of this process. What do we want to ensure is a return on the investment? So this is an investment in our students, and those thinking about what are the priorities and where. What is success beyond our K-12? So I think that's a great thing to pin and continue to discuss as we refine this process.
And Representative Reagan, you're speaking my language. I got to tell you, I appreciate that as a data guy myself. One of the things that's interesting, I think, in listing out those inputs, that one of the things I didn't hear you say was students. And I think that's really kind of where I hear this BEP modeling, trying to address some of those issues, because, we have some of our students who come to us with incredible challenges. We have ELL students, for example, who show up at our doors who don't speak any English. And I think that's, going to be one of the challenges to address that particular need. So I really, really love the way, in fact, as a fellow consultant, I've done, a lot of conversations, and I love the idea of what does success look like? How do we define success? And I think for our students is, meeting each of those students. And when we talk about the word equity here in Shelby County, Memphis Shelby County schools, as we say, what we do is we say, where do we meet that student, where that student is, with the idea that all of those students get to a particular level of performance. And as the senator pointed out, especially by third grade, we had a great conversation with some of our partners just yesterday, and we've got a big initiative going on. It's like, what are the factors associated with students being successful in the third grade? But I think you're right on target in having that idea of that we need to be really, really focused on what those, the metrics of measurement, are definitely going to be as we move forward with this, because as you guys do allocate those resources from the state legislature, what we need to do is we need to be really, really clear on where we're going and what success looks like and how we know when we get there. Understanding too that all of our students come to us really, and we're at our districts, are very, very different kinds of levels. And my hope and expectation, and I appreciate Danny Weeks for his leadership in this, Janice for making sure that we're headed along the right track, that we really understand that that BEP is that great leveler, and that in as much as we redesign and get something new, it catches and meets every student where they are and where they come to us from.
I think the question from the representative is an excellent question from the standpoint of how do you measure the effectiveness when it comes down to the overall educational programming for students, the value of nurse. There's some things you can look at from a standpoint of mental health across the state and how it's kept students in classrooms, kept students, we can look at attendance, we can look at discipline records. Have we decreased discipline? So I think we could probably apply some of those same metrics to nurses and some of those other positions, and also who we need to employ. So if you have these service, to me, I would think if you had some of these support service personnel in place, then you should see a lower need for assistant principals who generally do discipline most of their day. You should be able to see higher student attendance because the nurses are able to help put students back in the classroom quicker by being able to look at them from a medical view instead of calling a parent from the secretary. So I think we could probably come up with some metrics that'll help with that, to help answer those questions.
I do think that it's going to take a tremendous amount of unpacking of these goals that Representative Reagan suggested we need to develop, which I think is a good idea. But back to Senator Wally's point, take third grade reading. Sure, obviously you need a teacher, to teach the reading, but if you have students with disabilities, you have to have folks who can address those disabilities. Like Dr. Barker said, if you have students who don't speak English, they've got to speak English as kind of a prerequisite for learning to read English. If you've got PD is not something that is in the current BEP formula at all. So obviously you need professional development to help bring teachers along so that they can better teach reading. Do you need tutoring? If so, is that going to require educational assistance? Right now we're looking at the Tennessee All-Core as a tutoring structure. So each of these goals is going to take a lot of these things, like Steve said, nurses and addressing the social emotional. So I don't think it's as easy as just saying we want students to be able to read by third grade. Let's we need to throw in this amount of money for reading teachers and textbooks, because there's so much more that plays into that.
And I might say that I do recognize that. I would just think we need to be very front end loaded, because if we fail on the front end, we're not going to recapture these kind of outcomes and outputs that Representative Reagan mentioned as we move through their journey. So that was one thing. And the other thing I really like, I think I saw on one of your PowerPoint slides, is we often talk about those children with the greatest needs, understandably, and with the most adverse childhood experiences, but we don't talk a lot about those kids that are accelerated learners, and that I know that might be some political correctness concerns on the part of some in the education community when you use the term, quote, gifted. I'm not even sure that's a term that's used any longer, but those kids are out there. I've seen them in schools, you have too, and we have to be able to make sure that we're not just trying to find what is the very base that we can do that helps clear the bar at the lowest level. We need to be willing to set that bar high for those and challenge them to get there and put the resources into doing that too.
Janice, I know we have been encouraged not to work from the BEP.
Right.
try to change ratios in BEP, but could I ask the committee, because we're all familiar with the elements of the BEP and those pieces of the BEP that go into classroom instruction, can we just immediately, again, we all have our own opinions about the ratios and the different pieces and how much something's weighted and whether the numbers are accurate numbers or not, but can we start by looking at the elements of the BEP and either saying those elements are sufficient or we need to add these other elements to them? And Dr. Lilly, I think you mentioned a few of those that we know as directors of schools need to be added to those. So just in our reflections of the existing BEP, and again, I'm not talking about ratios at all, I'm just talking about topics. Art teachers, music teachers, CTE teachers, special education teachers, classroom teachers, principals, assistant principals, all of those. Could we come to any sort of agreement that those are necessary, those are not necessary, those are nice to have? Because I think, Janice, when I understand our recommendations that will be going to the entire committee, our subcommittee is challenged with preparing a document that we can send up. And so I think by either making statements that, yes, we agree with those, but we want to enhance those in some way, or we want to take away from something there, or we want to include something else that needs to be added. So are there things that we would say about, again, not the ratios or not the dollar allocations for BEP items now, but could we hear from everybody, or possibly just a large majority of us, some of those elements, do we think they're necessary, they're included, we need to make sure they're included, or any comments that you would share or make about those elements of BEP?
Well, I'd like to add, if transportation is going to be included, I think it needs to get that rides the bus once they get on the bus, whether it's within 1 mile of the school. We lose a lot of funding because there's a lot of kids that ride the bus less than a mile. So I do think that's us.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes, absolutely. Things like that. Dr. Lilly, I'm going to ask, I know you read those out a minute ago, but could you read that list of items that you talked about a minute ago, or some of those things that you had brought, that you said go into third grade reading proficiency?
Sure. Well, an area that's currently lacking in the BEP is that professional development. Districts spend a lot of money on professional development, so that is certainly an area. Or some of the other things, educational assistance, obviously the whole infrastructure as well as personnel to deal with a number of, to address students with disabilities, ELL, nurses, social emotional, whether it be counselors and or social workers. Just one thing that I think that is easy to overlook is that schools do so much more now than they used to in the past. And so we've largely had to try to find funding for that locally. Whereas if this is going to be a better education plan than just the basic, then I think we need to add all those things into the base.
Russell Dyer, and one thing I would say maybe think about, and we do this in a way, but we do pay for growth. If the school system is growing and they can get a certain amount, then you get extra funding for that, of course. But within a total population, for example, for us, we're seeing a huge growth in ESL, huge growth there. So, when we start thinking about specific populations of students, how can we better fund that to get to those ratios the state requires for teachers? Because it's really hard to get to that with the funding model that's out there right now with our current BEP. So I would want us to think about, if ESL is the example I'm using, if we're required to have X amount of teachers for every population of students, because you need small classes in that environment or else it doesn't work. How can we better fund that? How can we better look at that and break it down from the BEP that we currently have now?
So the way I understand it, Dr. Dyer, that would certainly be a weighting that would be in that tier 2 of the pyramid. So, so definitely weighting that addresses special needs, special challenges of those students.
Yeah.
Senator, to your point, a giftedness, to students that need that acceleration, students that would like opportunities to accelerate. Maybe that's through advanced placement classes. Maybe that's through gifted instruction in the classroom. Maybe that's IB programming, dual enrollment programming, any opportunity to accelerate in ELL. Great. Janice, are we at a good pace for you? I'm sorry.
Hey, yeah, doing great. And of course, our note taking is just to try to pull back anything we want to mention here, but it's all the recording, of course, we'll have. Recommendations really will start to bear out more as you have looked through the feedback. So this committee, is charged to comb through the feedback. We have had 6 out of the 8 town hall meetings already, and there are multiple just Twitter and social media. And that's part of what we're asking you to do as well, is to, in any of your engagements, connect over and ask, using that expertise, just to ask what might help inform and answer questions for you. You've posed several that help get that started. Just, yeah. Is that helpful?
I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, sorry about that, Gary. Yeah, just in terms of thinking about it, so one of the things we've done here at Memphis Shelby is to employ a student-based budgeting model. And we've got some weights, and we're excited about sharing those and can talk about that. Those carry those kinds of things like mobility, like the performance in a prior grade. If a student has low performance in a prior grade, there would be an adjustment and a weighting for that student as that student would come to you with particular needs. So that in-level, grade weighting between and among grades. But one of the things I'm really interested in knowing too is, and pushing toward that base level is, as we continue to say, what should every student have access to? And I would say that the current level of funding for information technology is in need of some pretty interesting rethought here, because, as we move to a digital environment, one of the things that we did was we spent some ESSER dollars toward making sure that we had one-to-one technology for all of our students. But I think that's, one of those base level kinds of things, that every student, to Michelle's point of, you got to transport the child to the school. So is there that level of funding, and is that adequate? You've got to be able to provide for the student in the school. And one of the things that's a first line for us in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, and I'm sure Senator Wally right there on that one, that just in terms of residents, that we have to meet students with their basic level of security needs, basic level of food needs. So is there any type of additional kind of thinking around providing? Obviously there's federal supports for that, but what kinds of things do we need for students to have in terms of supplies? So how do students interact with the classroom environment? And for us, the digital environment, I think, is so much more of a critical piece for us. So thinking about providing a more substantial technology piece as a base level. Students have to have access to teachers. Is there a level that we want to think about, providing, some additional for teachers who are not necessarily at a strong level of performance? I totally agree with those ideas of funding the upper level, and as far as the gifted and talented and opportunities there. I think, what about some additional supports for high performers? So that you would provide additional thoughts. Now that probably is more toward the top end of the pyramid, but you think about that, should every student, one of the things we're doing right now with some of our ESSER dollars is for students in K1 and 2 having access to not only a teacher in the classroom, but a classroom that's supported with a high functioning, high quality assistant. So, are we thinking about that, teachers have a lot of things on their plates, and in addition to, the wiping noses and taking kids to bathrooms and taking up money and that kind of stuff, they're asked to teach. Is there a reason that we might want to think about having some assistants that are provided there in that base level? But, it's been an exciting conversation around here. We could continue on these kinds of things, but the ideas of that pyramid, I think that's really, really huge for me and for us for our conversation.
John, when you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy, that reminded me. I don't think we had on our list. You mentioned school security and safe school environments. I don't, although I think all of us probably have SROs or some sort of security in place at our buildings, but I know that's not funded through BEP. So again, I think that would be something that we'll probably see and want to have some conversations about, as well as, you know, how does that play into the nice to haves and must have, you know, we're going to place that as well. So as we continue to receive pieces of data, and that would be one of those pieces that we would look at and see where that fits along the pyramid.
So as I think about once we have a new formula and the implications of budgeting under such a formula, you know, we've all brought up some things that aren't really addressed so much in the BEP. And the pyramid structure helps me understand how student-centered funding is based or structured. But a big question for me, if you're asking what information do I need, I still have like zero idea of the local contribution. How does that fit into to what the state's going to do? Because right now, locally, we are putting in lots of money to address some of these things that the BEP does not. So will the new funding formula take into account those things? And how does that reconcile with the local portion of funding?
Hey, yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's one that is going to be addressed more specifically with you, and it's a public feedback sessions for local funding bodies. So separate conversation with county funding bodies, county commissioners, directors. The commissioner noted she would also be working with the executive superintendent groups, priority engagement groups, but that will be run in a separate lane. I'm thinking it's in December, but this one, so for these subcommittees, we're really honing in on the state funding side of those particular needs that you could envision. So soliciting, you know, like these thoughts that you've percolated today, and then soliciting those out to others within any of the constituents that you're connected with, to help solicit more feedback and more of and this process, this new approach to policy making, which this is important in that it impacts everyone. So building out that opportunity for a collaborative way and a collaborative approach to solicit the feedback and those priorities. So through these subcommittees, we'll be refining. You'll get a batch of feedback that have already been sent in to tnedu.funding@tn.gov. And then as you get feedback, would like for you to send that there as well. And then as you come back here to talk about what is really surfacing for you, what's bearing out in that feedback, that's where you can this discussion can help prioritize into these categories, and then that's the process in these sessions to help us even get tighter to say yes. What's bearing out the preponderance of feedback is saying these are the critical elements for the base, and then the weights and such. That's a great question.
Jana, somewhat related to that, but and I know that's going down a lane that we're not prepared to go right now, but in the states that have done the student-centered funding, does fiscal indexing play a part of that, or does everyone get the same base and weights? How does that work? Do you know?
Yeah, and you know, I'll point you all to it's back to this chair overview, and then there was some conversation that really helped point us to look through other states that have already moved in this direction. Particularly paying attention to those in the Southeast, in the Midwest, but I think Illinois was pointed out. Danny, Dr. Weeks, that was, I think, on the chair call.
It was Indiana, not Illinois.
I'm sorry, Indiana. Gotcha. But yeah, so I feel like there were several resources that you may want to also look through, some of these comparisons that did bear out the weights and values and those different variables to help inform. Does that help answer your question?
And those are in the Google Drive that was sent on the link for this meeting.
Yeah, let me pull that over too.
That's okay. I can take a look at that separately. I was just curious if that had been any part of the discussion as far as the indexing.
Yeah, and I think that's still, that's definitely research that we can have and that you can pull in and solicit and then have those conversations. But for sure, that's part of this conversation of what we want to think through the weights and just part of the conversation.
And Diane, I think at one point in time, you and I had a conversation about, and again, I hate to keep coming back to the BEP, but you know, the BEP has a placeholder, for instance, for a teacher salary. And I think we understand that as a base teacher salary. And again, can we quantify that? And Diane, I think that was a conversation you and I had at one point in time that, you know, we don't just want a basic teacher salary as BEP implies, but we want a teacher salary which encourages somebody, some of our best and brightest to go into the field of education, teacher assistants who are quality teacher assistants who actually see that as a viable career, not just something that they may be falling back on. Do you remember that conversation? And can you share some of those thoughts about, you know, some of the placeholders that are in there? And again, we're not assigning dollar values to that, but just a quantifiable statement that says, you know, a teacher's salary in the new funding formula should reflect. Do you remember that conversation we had?
I remember making a statement about the teacher's salary. We not only need to raise the base teacher salary, but we also need to remember those that have been with us for so many years, because I have learned through this in my 41 years, it seems like the younger ones are the most mobile. They have a tendency to move from district to district, and we need some type of a raise in there for them where they'll be willing to stay with districts like Pickett instead of going across the state line to Albany, Kentucky, or maybe to York Institute where the benefits are so much better. But we need to remember all those teachers too. And
I remember for our conversation, it was something to the effect that, you know, that every child, you know, because again, we're trying to frame it from a child's perspective, but every child would have access to a teacher who has an appropriate wage that reflects their education, training, and experience and expertise, and a benefit package which is inclusive of those things necessary of a professional. And it's been quite some time since we had that conversation, but you know, so a statement like that about, you know, all positions, that it's not just a number that, you know, is going to vary so much from state to state and from what district we work in or we teach in, but that it truly reflects, same thing for administrative salaries, you know, the administrative salary in the new formula reflects the work and the hours of dedication that a trained professional with a master's degree or higher devotes toward that time.
Danny, I'd just like to comment on that too. And I see this as a tremendous input that affects the outcome for all students, because the number one determining factor in a student's academic success is a classroom teacher. And I think all of us understand that. We know, we can read the research, and I think everything points to that. And I like to tell people all the time is the schools and the school systems that have the best teachers win. They win because their students are going to have great outcomes, because their teachers are well paid and well supported. And I think anything that we have conversation here around ought to consider that as being at the very heart and soul of what we do. Is we have to understand that we've got to attract, retain, and continue to support our teachers with world-class training. Because in my opinion, every child deserves to be served by a high-performing teacher.
Janice, let's all note on our header up there that we're within 5 minutes, so we will be needing to kind of draw our comments to a close this afternoon. Would remind everyone that we will be, the state's having their 2 last public town hall meetings. one this coming Monday night, and then one the following Tuesday night. And those, along with the additional Twitter meetings that are taking place, and certainly the email address that anyone can send that information to. And then it's my understanding, Byron, you said the next meeting dates for us December 9th at noon as well. And for us, Janice, you want to give us a preview? We would have that information by that next meeting or prior to that next meeting, I hope. That's
right. Yes. You should receive the batch of information. Show you access on your invitation. You would have these 3 links. And so today's materials will be in this Google Drive. So you can just scroll down and click there. And then the other toolkits and resources to help support is as you're thinking through outreach and soliciting from others, you can pull from information there. But yes, you will have a batch of feedback to start refining and putting into those categories. And then when we come to the next meeting on December 9th, you'll really have kind of that preponderance of information to say, okay, here's what really is bearing out. This is what I'm seeing. And then have conversations to categorize that, prioritize, and as you noted earlier, getting towards some cost values as well. But discussing the feedback, categorizing into those priorities, and moving toward thinking through, well, at what cost, at what weighted percentage, things of that nature.
And John, I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, could you either get your Memphis Shelby County weighting scale either to Ms. Janice or to me, so that I could share that with everybody on the committee as well, just again for us to have something to talk about, not saying that's what we like or what we believe or anything like that, just so we could have a frame of reference, because I've not seen anything like that yet. So I'd like to at least take a look at that, and I'd like to share that with the committee if you don't mind.
Will do.
Thank you very much for that.
All right.
What other information do we need before we adjourn today and gather back together? I appreciate everyone's participation, Senator and Representative. We thank you particularly for being with us and joining us today. And we will see everyone back. Hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving week next week. And so it'll be a couple weeks after there. And if you feel the need to contact me, you have my contact information. Please feel free to reach out or to Janice, and we talk regularly. So thank you again for the day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.